In the quiet corners of a seemingly perfect home, Clara felt an unsettling presence, something darker than the silence that hung in the air. Every whisper of wind, every shadow in the corners of her vision seemed to carry a warning. One night, a strange figure appeared in the yard, setting off a chain of events that would unravel the disturbing truths her family had buried for years. As she uncovered long-forgotten secrets, Clara discovered a past soaked in tragedy, a curse passed down through generations, and a terrifying truth that would change everything she knew about her family and herself. But with each answer, the danger grew, and soon Clara would find out that some secrets were never meant to be revealed. At the edge of a sleepy suburban town, there stood an unremarkable gray house, hidden behind a veil of tall oak trees. To an outsider, the house appeared normal, trimmed hedges, a worn swing in the yard, and a faint whistle of the wind passing through the cracked shutters. But to 8-year-old Clara, the house was anything but normal. It was a prison, a place she both dreaded and called home. Clara's life had always felt like an endless cycle of rules and expectations. But these rules were not ones that could be spoken out loud. They were unspoken laws that had to be followed, and failure to adhere meant consequences that Clara could feel long after they were over. Her parents, Jonah and Elaine, were stern figures, almost statuesque in their presence. Jonah, a man of few words, had a steady, unyielding gaze that never seemed to soften. Elaine, on the other hand, wore her emotions on her sleeve, but they were always negative disappointment, frustration, anger. Neither of them seemed to notice how much the coldness of their love was taking its toll on Clara. From the time Clara could remember, she had been expected to meet impossible standards. At first, it was small things, always sitting up straight, using the correct fork, responding with perfect manners. But over the years, these minor requests became demands. Her room had to be spotless at all times, her grades had to be perfect, her behavior immaculate. Any slip-up, no matter how small, was met with consequences that didn't make sense. A dirty dish left in the sink could mean a week of silent treatment, a missing pencil, hours of chores. As Clara grew older, she started to notice that her parents had a strange way of measuring her worth. Her brother Max was their pride and joy. He was the one they always praised, the one who could do no wrong. Max, unlike Clara, seemed to effortlessly fall in line with their expectations. He was quiet, obedient, and always did as he was told, never questioning their authority. Clara, on the other hand, was always a little too curious, a little too wild for their liking. When Max was born, Clara had been excited, thinking he would be a companion, a playmate, someone to fill the space between her and her parents. But as Max grew, he became a constant source of attention. He needed constant care, his cries often interrupting Clara's every thought. She began to resent him not out of malice, but because it felt as though he was the reason her parents no longer had time for her. Her world shrank further when Max was diagnosed with a mild condition that required frequent medical attention. Suddenly, the house became a revolving door of doctors, nurses, and specialists. Clara was told to be quiet, to stay out of the way, to not disturb the delicate balance that Max's condition required. She started to disappear into the background, a ghost in her own home. She spent most of her time alone in her room, reading books or drawing in the margins of her school notebooks. But the walls of her room felt like they were closing in on her, as if the house was pressing down, suffocating her with its emptiness. Her parents rarely spoke to her except to tell her what to do or what she had done wrong. There was no warmth in their eyes, no softness in their voices. Clara learned early on that affection was a luxury that only Max seemed to receive. One evening, after a particularly silent dinner where Jonah had scolded her for not folding her napkin in half just right, Clara decided to take a walk. She didn't ask for permission, because asking was futile. It was the only thing she could do without anyone telling her what to do, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of freedom as her feet carried her down the sidewalk. She wandered to the edge of the yard, where the old oak tree stood tall and proud. It was a massive tree, its branches twisting and stretching out into the sky like the arms of an ancient being. Clara often found solace beneath its leaves, the world around her fading away as she sat in the quiet shade. The tree had always been her place of escape, a refuge where she could pretend for a moment that life was different, that she wasn't just Clara, the invisible daughter. Beneath its thick canopy, Clara felt like she could breathe again. The tree seemed to understand her silent pain, its roots digging deep into the earth, as if to hold her secrets in place. On that particular evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Clara climbed into the branches of the oak tree, her feet finding their familiar spots among the gnarled limbs. She had brought with her a notebook, one she kept hidden beneath her bed. Inside it were her thoughts, her dreams, her fears, her hopes for something more. She didn't know why she wrote. Maybe it was a way to hold on to herself when everything else felt like it was slipping away. The ink of her pen scratched across the page as she wrote about the life she wished she had. She wrote about a family that didn't judge her for every little mistake. She wrote about a world where she didn't feel like a burden. She wrote about her loneliness, the way it wrapped around her heart like a tight cord that wouldn't let go. But as Clara continued to write, something felt different. The wind began to pick up, the leaves rustling as if they were whispering something to her. A shadow crossed her vision, darkening the sky just a little. Clara looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment she thought she saw someone standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the reach of the trees. The figure was tall, draped in a dark cloak that billowed slightly in the wind. Clara froze, unsure whether it was her imagination playing tricks on her. But before she could process what she had seen, the figure was gone, disappearing into the twilight. Her breath came in short bursts as she climbed down from the tree, the notebook clutched tightly to her chest. She didn't know why, but she felt the sudden urge to run inside, as if something dangerous was lurking just outside her door. That night Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The house felt different, colder, even though nothing had physically changed. The silence that had once been a comfort now seemed heavy, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't escape. She had always known that her family was broken in some way, but that evening, something deep within her shifted. She began to wonder if the strange figure she had seen by the tree was a sign, a warning, or perhaps even an answer. Whatever it was, Clara knew that she was no longer content to live in the shadows of her parents' expectations. The tree had always been her refuge, but now it seemed to be calling her towards something far more mysterious, something she couldn't yet understand but felt deep in her bones. Whatever the truth was, Clara was determined to find it. She just didn't know yet how far it would take her. The days following that eerie encounter by the oak tree were filled with uncertainty. Clara's thoughts consumed her, swirling like a storm, but her parents remained oblivious to the growing sense of dread inside her. They continued with their routines, her father, Jonah, heading off to work early in the morning and returning late, while her mother, Elaine, kept the house running like a machine. To the outside world, everything appeared normal, even perfect. But Clara felt the strange shift in the air that seemed to follow her every move. She spent her days at school, her attention divided between the mundane lessons and the mystery that was beginning to unfold in her mind. There was a constant nagging feeling that she was being watched, that something was lurking just out of reach. It wasn't the kind of feeling that could be shaken off easily. It was as though the house itself, with all its silence and secrets, was closing in on her. Clara's curiosity about the figure she had seen by the oak tree only deepened as the days wore on. She tried to dismiss it, to convince herself that it had simply been a trick of the fading light or her own imagination. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. There had been something tangible about the way the figure had stood there, watching her from the shadows, something that felt too real to ignore. One afternoon after school, Clara decided to revisit the yard. She needed to see the tree again, to understand why it had felt different that night. As she stepped outside, the cool breeze brushed against her skin, and for a brief moment she thought she could smell something unfamiliar, something earthy, almost as if the ground itself was alive with whispers. She made her way to the oak tree, her heart beating faster with each step. As she approached, she noticed something strange. The ground near the base of the tree seemed disturbed, as if someone had recently dug into the earth. Clara bent down, her fingers brushing the soil. There, half buried, was a small, weathered box. Her breath caught in her throat as she carefully unearthed it. The box was small, no larger than a jewelry box, and its wood was worn, the surface etched with faded markings. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs and a letter tied with a faded ribbon. She knew in that moment that the box held answers to the questions that had been haunting her since she first found the journal in the attic. The photographs were black and white, their edges curling with age. Clara's fingers lingered over them as she tried to make sense of the faces staring back at her. One photograph stood out in particular, a woman with dark hair and piercing eyes, holding a baby in her arms. The woman looked familiar, but Clara couldn't place her. And the baby looked strangely like her, as if she were staring into her own eyes. With a sense of foreboding, Clara unwrapped the letter. The handwriting was delicate, looping in elegant strokes. As she read, the words seemed to echo in her mind, each one sending a chill down her spine. "My dearest Clara, I hope you never find this. But if you do, know that you are the one who can change everything. Your parents, they are not who they seem. There is a truth hidden deep within our family, one that has been buried for years. The past is not as it appears. There is more to the story, more than your mother and father will ever tell you. But you must find it. You must uncover what they have hidden." Clara's hands shook as she held the letter, the weight of its words sinking into her like lead. She couldn't understand it, not fully. Who had written this letter? And why had it been hidden in a box beneath the oak tree? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp sound, a twig snapping underfoot. Clara whipped around, her heart racing. But there was no one there. The yard was still, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the leaves. She stood there for a moment, her senses heightened, before carefully tucking the box and letter into her jacket. The mystery was deepening, and Clara knew she couldn't stop now. She had to know the truth. But as she made her way back to the house, her steps heavy with the weight of the secrets she was beginning to uncover, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. And this time she wasn't sure if it was just her imagination. That night Clara couldn't sleep. The house was unusually quiet, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day over and over in her mind. The box, the letter, the photographs, everything was connected, but she couldn't quite see the full picture. Her parents hadn't mentioned the box, which only made Clara more suspicious. They never spoke of their past, and anything that seemed to connect them to their history was buried deep. She knew that the only way to understand the significance of the box was to confront them. But how could she? What if they lied to her again? What if they shut her down as they always did when she asked too many questions? Clara waited until the house was quiet, her parents fast asleep. She slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and crept down the hallway to the attic. The chest, the one she had found earlier in the year, was still there, hidden in the far corner. She opened it slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and pulled out the old journal. As she flipped through the pages, she saw that they were filled with more than just memories. There were notes, sketches, and cryptic phrases that seemed to hint at something darker. One phrase stood out: "The fire will come for us all." Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What fire? And who had written this? Before she could continue, she heard a noise, a faint sound from the staircase. Clara froze, her breath held tight in her chest. Someone was awake. The footsteps grew louder, and Clara's heart skipped a beat. She quickly shoved the journal back into the chest, but just as she was about to close it, she heard the door creak open. Her mother's voice, soft and steady, drifted through the house. "Clara, I know you're awake. Clara's heart stopped. How had she known? Had she been caught? Was she about to face the wrath of her parents for uncovering their secrets? Her mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale in the dim light. There was no anger in her eyes, only something that Clara couldn't quite read, a mix of fear and sadness. "It's time you knew the truth," Elaine said, her voice barely above a whisper. The truth was more horrifying than Clara could have ever imagined. Sitting in the attic with her mother, Clara learned the long-hidden story of her family's past. Elaine spoke of a tragedy, one that had taken place before Clara was born. It was a fire that had destroyed their first home, taking with it the life of Clara's older sister, Lily. Lily had been only a year old when the fire broke out, and despite their best efforts, they couldn't save her. Elaine's voice cracked as she spoke of that night, the terror of watching her home burn, the feeling of helplessness that had consumed her. She admitted that the fire had been no accident. It was a result of something darker, something they couldn't explain. A curse, she called it, a curse that had followed their family for generations. Clara was stunned. A curse? She couldn't wrap her mind around it. How could such a thing be real? But the fear in her mother's eyes told a different story. Elaine explained that after the fire, everything had changed. The grief had torn the family apart, and though they had moved on, the shadows of the past had never fully left. "There's more to it, Clara," Elaine said softly. "Lily's death wasn't the end. The fire, it was only the beginning." Clara's mind spun as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The box, the letter, the photographs, it all made sense now. Her family had been hiding from something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But before Clara could ask any more questions, the door slammed open. Jonah stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. "It's time," he said simply. Clara had no choice but to follow her parents. The weight of the truth hung heavily on her shoulders as they led her through the house, down to the basement. The air was thick with the smell of dust and dampness, and as they reached the final door, Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Elaine unlocked the door, and Clara stepped into the cold, dark room. Inside, the walls were lined with old photographs and strange symbols, all eerily familiar. "This is where it all began," Jonah said, his voice grim. Clara stared at the pictures of her parents when they were younger, smiling together with Lily in their arms. But there was something wrong with the photos, something that made Clara's blood run cold. Some of the faces were blurred, distorted. And in the background, shadows seemed to move, just out of focus. Elaine took a deep breath. "This is the curse," she said softly. "It's been following us generation after generation." Clara couldn't comprehend it. A curse? Could such a thing be real? But before she could ask, the lights flickered and the room grew colder. "The fire will come for us all," Jonah whispered. The truth was out. And now there was no turning back.